or even combining the different modalities. So that's one of the areas that the paper alludes to. The other one is monitoring framework. We know very much that more often than not in our responses, it's about how many people have we reached, yeah? But a big aspect of market-based programming is being able to see really, in alignment with the do no harm principle, in alignment with supporting local markets, do we have the monitoring in place that facilitates us to be able to get to that information and actually conclude that it is working or not working. And then ensuring quality. As public health practitioners, I'm sure many of you would agree with me, there's been quite the concern that if we do, for instance, give cash and say, go and get the product on the local market, how sure are we about the product? Are we giving up on our imperative to ensure that the public health issues are addressed to the level that we would expect? So some of the concerns that were being shared by the WASH practitioners. And then, of course, there being no evidence base or little evidence base to show that market-based programming could work. Yeah, and it's a challenge also that was put up in terms at the recommendation stage that we do need to provide an evidence base in terms of how it can work. And finally, linking emergency to development. In working with the markets, it's not just about the emergency response or crisis, whatever management, but about the longer term issues, sustainability, building community resilience. How are we working with, looking to work with markets, especially for the WASH sector, in linking these two areas? So those were some of the key highlights I just wanted to highlight in terms of some of the discussions with regards to cash and markets in the WASH sector, at least by the global WASH cluster paper that was done last year. So that pretty much is serving as a background. I'm not sure if there's any question, point of note at this point.
Why don't you, you see Roger's question up there?
Sorry, because I have the screen up, let me just back to.
Great. If you can go onto your chat, there's two questions. One from Kit Dyer, and the other, Roger has a recommendation. Roger, maybe you would like to just speak your observation.
Hi there. Yes, so I was looking back at that pie chart you had on the second slide, maybe, and looking at the different directions you can take. And it seemed to me that when we were talking about our water trucking problem earlier on, the dysfunctional nature of that market, of that service provision, indicates that the top segment, reform of market policies, norms, rules, is ultimately where a response would be needed. Of course, there are many things we can do in the interim, and that would be a tough nut to crack. We've got to try to persuade decision makers that this is a situation that needs to change. Has anyone seen or worked in a context where that kind of conversation might be possible?
Yeah, Parvin, if you go to full screen on your PowerPoint, we can see your slide, but it's just, if you just go to full screen on the PowerPoint, yeah, there you, yeah, we're going.
Yeah.
You know, what's interesting, Roger, is before let me just jump in here. This is a piece of work that is currently being done by NRC's team in Gaza and Oxfam as others. It's about how do we work with the existing and the pilot water trucking operations on a market norms and regulations. A lot of it is focusing on making sure about the quality of the water versus other issues that might also be concerned about markets, such as pricing or coverage or things. But there is some interesting stuff that our teams in Gaza are trying to do. Unfortunately, they're not able to attend this week, but we're because of some things, but we're hoping to get some more information from them shortly. So, Parvin, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think generally the fact that based on what we are seeing, that people now want to, even wash practitioners want to ask themselves these questions much more. More often than not, we tend to be to look at market-based programming at the point of when we want to intervene. It's sort of been limited to, oh, we want to do a response. How can we use the markets to be able to support the response? But then taking a step back and sort of pushing back in terms of where else can we be able to utilize them? How can we build on the regulations or address the issues around the regulations, the policies that are affecting the delivery during crisis?
Could somebody turn their microphone off if they're not using it? We can hear Parvin and some disco music or something.
Actually,
I wanted to ask you on one thing.
Mohammed, Kit has got a question first, so we're going to go with Kit's question.
So let me try and see if I can get the chat. Yeah, there, voila, got it.
Yeah, no, I can chat myself. Thanks, Pavan. That was kind of interesting in different ways. I'm also interested in the whole pie chart, but to come back to the Global Wash Cluster, the piece of work that we produced, the position paper, this is a bit of a self-interested question. As you said, I worked on part of that with a big group of people. How useful was that to you in you trying to set up a framework for what you wanted to do? And are there things that we could do to improve it, to make it a better tool for setting up the kind of things you want to do?
What I'd say is it was good to actually even see the discussion taking place, because like I said earlier, more often than not, when it comes to markets, we've tended to have it under the food security. Yeah, the thinking has evolved quite significantly under the food security sector. So that being the case, and also the other thing has been the pushback from us as WASH practitioners on market-based programming, saying, no, it wouldn't work, clearly, you know. But so the thought process that went into saying, okay, so these are the concerns that we have, yeah, and these are the proposals. For instance, even saying we need to get our monitoring framework in place so that we can be able to actually inform that decision. We need to be able to build the evidence base. And similarly, for instance, that's why one of the reasons why even participating in platform, you know, need to through it. As humanity practitioners, that's to apply it, but asking ourselves, how does it work for us? So yeah, I think it was very useful.
Look, and that's music to my ears, I have to tell you. But as I said, I'm a bit self-interested. And Rick, if I may, a second one, I'm linking the presentation Andy just did on the what do you call them, the electronic meters, so to speak. Could you see then a way of using that work to link to that reform of market policies, norms and rules by educating what we do in that area? Because I know that we do in other parts of market-based programming, we might find it easy to intervene at that space, but maybe in water trucking, it's something that's difficult because of all the other pieces of the puzzle. And maybe the stuff that Oxfam, you guys have been working on, will help us to actually make it easier to start to develop the evidence to reform market policies, norms and rules.
Good, thank you. Mohammed Abdi, you've got a question about, it's about, it seems like the question is being in where there's not a lot of established water trucking companies, how do you carry out water trucking? That's a big, broad question. Does anybody want to any of our panelists want to take a stab at answering it?
Somebody said buy a truck. Yeah. If you don't mind, Mohammed, later on I will be talking about one of the market assessments that was done, and maybe I can help. I can allude to some of the thinking around that. Would that be okay?
That's very good. So let's now go on to the rest of your presentation, Parvin. Thank you.
Okay. So.
You were there. You
Sorry.
screen again,
and then I now move on to the next one.
there you go.
I think Parvin should actually host the next one, Rick, because her skills are much better than yours.
Are they? I'm like right now trying to get myself to my next screen, and it's totally freezing on me.
Point taken, Kit. Point taken.
Okay, voila. So we have talked about the Global Watch Cluster paper on cash and markets, and I wanted to narrow down on the work in Ethiopia. Please note again, I'm not sure how many of on the platform here have worked in Ethiopia before, or are currently working in Ethiopia. I hope, so perfect. So in every essence, speaking to issues that you are familiar with. So right now, in terms of where Oxfam is working, we do have work in the Somali region with the drought response. In City Zone, we have a resilience project. And I'll point out that in City Zone, we did have a drought response project in 2014, which I think Jack was involved in. We also have the refugee wash response that Andy referred to earlier on the left of the slide, if you can see it. And then generally the other areas marked in yellow are more the development long-term projects. Just a bit of background in terms of where we are at in Ethiopia. Now, moving to market assessment. Do you remember, I think in the first point I mentioned earlier was the need to understand the context on the Global Wash Cluster paper on cash and markets. They need to understand the context. Now, one of the ways in which we've tended to look at the context or try to get an understanding of the context and how we can be able to utilize markets for emergency response has been through what is called EMA. Yeah, I'm not sure, I believe most of us are familiar with the terminology. So in 2012, Oxfam was involved in conducting an emergency market mapping analysis, and the background to this was that it had been noted that there was failed rain, yeah, and so there was a likelihood the local authorities were asking to have an intervention in terms of water supply to the area. So the preliminary wash assessment at that point indicated that the rainwater reserves would soon be exhausted. This was specifically in the Jijiga area. They were looking at Harshin, Obere, and Kebriye warriors. And the concerns were, from the assessments were the water was, the reserves were running low, especially the rainwater ones, ponds, the birkads, and then approximately at that time, 125,000 people needed to have water supplied to them for nearly 3 months. Yeah. So as part of determining what the intervention was going to be, Oxfam undertook an emergency market mapping analysis where they were looking at the possibility of giving cash, to the affected population to try and assess whether, for them to be able to access water. Yeah. So the things they were then trying to determine were, for example, since water tracking is something that is common to the area, would the commercial water trackers be able to deliver the anticipated amount of water? And then to determine which modality they use. Would cash be the best option? What would really be the best modality in terms of serving population there? And then generally getting an understanding of the water and water transportation markets. So that was pretty much the background in terms of why the EMA, as it were, was undertaken then. So to be able to get there, there are certain key questions that were looked at. One, how has the availability of water been affected by the crisis? Yeah. So what happened in this case was looking at comparing, the water situation with other years. And usually, as part of the EMA process, you develop what is called a seasonal calendar. You compare 1 year. In this case, they used 2009 as a normal year. And then they compared it with 2011, where there had also been quite a big dry spell, yeah? And also now looking at 2012. So they compared the water situation as it were, looking at the amount of water people are able to get, the changes in terms of the price of water, because often what happens during the different parts of during periods of the year, people buy water at different prices, yeah? And looking at the different sources of water and who has access to them. So that was the first question. How has the availability of water been affected by the crisis? The second question was about, does the market have sufficient capacity to meet the needs of the population? Yeah. So, and as part of it, talking to the water vendors, getting to know where do they get their water, how how many trucks. There's the question that Mohammed had asked, yeah, if are there enough trucks in the area to serve the population. Like I mentioned earlier, at that point there had been an estimated figure of 125,000 people that needed to be served with water. Yeah. So doing a calculation, I'll share with you the findings briefly, but getting to know, does the market have sufficient capacity to meet the needs, and what are the constraints on the market, yeah, of being able to supply? And then the last question was about what is the preferred modality of water provision by the stakeholders. So one of the things you see in the slide here is a community meeting where it was around getting to know who are the people that in every essence would need water, yeah, and based on a certain criteria. And so looking at the findings of this, I'm just highlighting sort of the key findings. I'll be able to share the detailed report from the EMA that was done in 2012 for details. So some of the key findings at that point, one was the water sources. In this case, the surface water in Harshin were inadequate. Harshin at that point did not have any groundwater sources, and based on previous experiences, what the community shared is, if often what would then happen is that they would need to get water delivered using water truckers from outside the Wareda. Yeah. So and then you remember earlier I mentioned that there were 3 Waredas they were looking at, but Harshin was the one with the highest one. The surface waters were looking at a period of 2 to 3 weeks only, in terms of being the period of time they would last before they actually ran out of water. And 2, the fact that they did not have any other permanent water sources. So that was a bit of an issue in terms of the areas that needed support. And then 2, on the issue about the market having sufficient capacity, what they did find was that while the water truckers have the capacity, to be able to get water from outside, in the report there is a breakdown in terms of the water sources where the different truckers go to and how much water they can be able to get from that water point. So a calculation in terms of getting to see what are the possibilities in terms of access. What was highlighted was that there was a gap between the linkage between the water transporters and the Harshin population. Mostly because more often than not, what happened was for the richer community members, they would have the contacts for water truckers, and the richer community members, some of them would have their own beer cards, and the water truckers would deliver water to these beer cards. So in terms of an intervention, that the organization, or at least the intervention, would then look at also supporting the linkage between the water truckers and the community actors, or using these community actors to be able to facilitate this connection. And then the other finding was that the poor groups within the community, which were approximated at that time at being, based on also the food security assessment, at being 60% of the population, yeah? So that it was estimated that they would have a gap of 3 months in terms of meeting their survival needs, yeah? So that being the case, one of the things they were then saying in terms of an intervention is how to specifically target the poor. Yeah, and as part of it, including the consideration of using vouchers target the target group. Yeah, so
Parvin, I'm
so
going to
that
stop right now for a question.
questions.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that's
Roger,
fine. Let me just look
Jack,
through them.
you may be able to give this as answer too as well. Roger's asked, in the example in Harshim, did we check for unintended consequences or harm in the waredas that the truckers came from? Did other people go without water? And I don't know if Parvin or Jack want to answer that. Parvin?
Yeah, they did. I think one of the post surveys calculated that approximately 78% of the people still did not get, 78% were able to get water. So that's like 22% did not get the water as it was. So yes, there were also side issues from the intervention noted with regards to not everybody getting water.
Great. Okay, great. Any other questions about this, specifically the 2012 market assessment or the conclusions of that? Great. Then let's go on to your next, talking about what you're doing now and how you've changed as a result.
So and then in this, the other market assessment I wanted to mention was this year, what we've been doing, I'm calling it pre-post, it's pretty much terminology in terms of whether the crisis is over or not, yeah? And in this case, the market assessment that we are currently undertaking, and we've undertaken it just trying to get the data in, was how can the market be prepared in order to help address future crisis needs, mostly because of the fact that, as many of you know, more often than not, for Ethiopia, drought is a recurring crisis. Yeah. So what can we do around contingency planning, contracting of vendors, the process, storage? So a couple of issues that we are trying to currently look at in terms of preparing the market better for a crisis response. Yeah. So and also the revision of modalities. Like I said earlier, there were things that were noted from the different responses, and that was both the 2012 drought response in Jujiga area, also the city zone in 2014, and Jack can be able to speak to that, and also with the current drought response work that we've been doing. So a couple of issues that continue to come up as we do the drought response. So that's on market assessments. I'm not sure if we want to, if I can move on to the vouchers.
Yeah, let's move right on to the vouchers. But I mean,
okay.
the important point here is that using the market assessment tool can be useful both in understanding before a crisis happens, during a crisis, and what's interesting about this one is to looking at what's happened when an agency like Oxfam is slowing down their operations or closing it, looking at both the impact of our operations, our water trucking operations on the market, but also what are going to be some potential flashpoints or areas of concern in the future. Is that right, Parvin?
Yeah, it is. It is. The current one was informing the exit strategy.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how much detail to go into with on the issue of the vouchers, to be honest, because
we have 15 minutes. So if you could finish up, just I think making a distinction between the changes in how you're doing vouchers from a household to vouchers towards a community, and talk about some of the how the market assessment helped you understand that, and then we'll go into the final 10 minutes of questions. So we'll give you 5 more minutes, Parvin.
Okay, that's fine. So again, in 2012, we used vouchers. In 2014, we also used vouchers. In this case, they were used at the sort of distributed to targeted beneficiaries. And one of the things I mentioned was that if you see in the slide, the vouchers can either be for single use or they can be, as is the one here, for multiple use. Yeah. So and the process involved, the beneficiaries going with the vouchers and giving them to the vendors as they supplied water, and then as you can see, my right, the redemption process around it. Now, there are a couple of issues that have come up with the use of vouchers. Often we have positive feedback in terms of the beneficiaries saying at least it assured them of getting the water that they wanted. But the concerns enough times also came from the water vendors, because part of it being that if you're measuring per, so to speak, per jerrycan, while they are coming in with Vouchers of 10,000 liters, it becomes another different issue in terms of assuring them that they will get paid for the amount they actually went to, whatever, deliver to the site. As in, of course, they did deliver the 10,000, as was with Andy's presentation. So, and then the other thing is setting up the infrastructure for vouchers. You have to print the vouchers, you have to distribute the vouchers, and the redemption process being quite the logistical undertaking. So that being the case, that those are some of the things then that became we continue to deal with when you're talking about using vouchers. So this year, what they did use, I'll skip that one because we can always refer to it. What this year they did use was what they're calling community vouchers, more at the point of delivery. Yeah, it could easily be a goods received note, but then so that it focused on the amount of water that was delivered to the site, and then there were the water was storage tanks, which were then linked to the distribution system. So that was the case, and mostly because of the, I think, like I said, the logistical work around setting up the voucher process, but also the feedback from the vendors in terms of the process for redemption. And then I will mention also, based on experience, even in Kenya, enough times what happens with people, with the beneficiaries worrying about the loss of the voucher, some of them would give the water vendor and say, just make sure I can be able to collect the amount of water that I wanted. So these are the two scenarios in which we've used vouchers and the different experiences around use of the vouchers.
Great.
Any questions at that point?
There's a number of questions in the chat box about this. Kit, do you want to start? You were talking about a couple of things. One is a consistent approach across agencies, and the other is about electronic vouchers.
No, I was just noticing on the paper voucher, Pavin, that you've got a number of different agency stamps, and I think there's a bit of a discussion in the chat column about multi-use vouchers, but so NTA's got an operation in Gambella region in a couple of the camps, and we're looking at NFIs attached to electronic vouchers that have multiple wallets or pockets in the wallet. And I could imagine, I agree with Jack that there could be a problem if people are moving around a lot, but in the refugee camps, the moving around, not so much, I don't think. And it could be just another way of building into that voucher system that's already in place. All the infrastructure is already there. The vendors, the feedback we get from shop type vendors on items is that they like it because it's easy to manage, and it uses that same kind of electronic download when there's connectivity. So it doesn't have, it's not a same with the system Andy was talking about. It's not a live system 100% of the time. It's live twice a day, 3 times a day, so that it continues to work. I don't know. We're not using trucking systems in, well, maybe a little bit in that part of the world. So it could be something that becomes part of the fabric of how we work in a place like that. But I suspect in other places, like where you're looking to use this over in Eastern Ethiopia, the concept of using the multi-pocketed sort of electronic vouchers is going to be a bit trickier to implement.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah, and I think like Jack was saying, the mobility, it also became an issue with when in some cases with the community, the beneficiaries receiving the vouchers and then moving to a different place, and often an agreement has been made with the vendor in terms of which area they're delivering the water to. So that's been there. With the electronic vouchers, more often than not, like for instance, even in urban areas, and this is slightly different in terms of like for disease outbreak response, where you're looking at delivery of certain things. So they can be used, the e-vouchers can be used, and I think more and more consideration, especially as we look at the fact that we're using a lot more digital work. And then I think the other thing that was alluded to here was with regards to the multiple, for instance, if you have a food program and you have the wash, whatever, very much, if you ask me, even from the logistical, and I keep saying logistical because that enough times became part of the challenge, and so utilizing, one platform for various products would also make sense.
Jacinta, can you hear me? Do you want to ask your question? I will ask your question for you. I have unmuted you on it, but Jacinta was suggesting, Jacinta is our NRC's WASH person currently in Tanzania. Mm-hmm. Jacinta, are you there? Okay. Her question. Oh, there you are. Mm-hmm. Jacinta, can you ask your question or make your point?
Maybe I can just speak to it because I can see the question here. It's talking about market assessments and how they need to consider the effects of IDP, the water approach. I think very much so. Again, the context, understanding the context, and understanding the community that you're dealing with, which is why we were saying, I mentioned earlier that it's not a one size fits all. Yeah, the fact that we have to be open to looking at what would work in this case. Yeah, so very much so in terms of, I agree with you, Jacinta, the fact that we have to look at the different contexts.
Now, Parvin, one of the things that I thought interesting when we talked about your presentation yesterday was, and I think it's worth mentioning, is that part of can you explain a little bit more about part of the rationale for moving from vouchers going directly to households to vouchers going to communities?
Yeah, I spoke to it a little bit in terms of the challenges around setting up the infrastructure for the voucher. Yeah, I think one of the things was that if you remember with this current drought response, yeah, we've had a lot of movement of the communities or the different affected households to IDP camps. Yeah, and there's quite a rapid scale up. Yeah, so being able to set up that infrastructure was part of the issue. And then two, like I said, the fact that there was a bit of pushback from the vendors because they were saying if we have to deliver on the basis of each of the individual voucher, which is, for instance, 20 liters today, 20 liters tomorrow, it's hard for them to account, yeah, or it's hard for them it's a long process with the redemption process. So those are some of the issues that were being talked about when it came to the decision around why they opted to use the higher level, the community level voucher.
And as you mentioned yesterday, is that the communities where these vouchers are being introduced have a history of during drought situations of trying to collectively share the water that they have. Is that right? That there's so it's not it going from everybody scrambling themselves to get water, but working with communities who have a cultural and a tradition to be able to try to share water. So this isn't creating a new community structure in locations where community structures may not exist. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the issue around the sharing was something, for instance, that was found in the market assessment in terms of, for instance, the richer communities having households rather sharing water with their poorer relatives, especially. Yeah. So that being the case, that there is sort of a system that as it were traditional, that allows for other people to be able to access water when they do not have. The amount of it being definitely different, depending on the context. So, but there's usually different coping strategies that the communities put in place to be able to support other whatever members.
Great. Do you want to ask you've been getting some comments about your question. Do you want to ask your question, especially the second part of it about seasonal variations and that?
No, I'm reading the comments now. I think more or less my question was answered.
Too late. I put you on the spot. You got to ask your question so we can all hear.
Yeah. No, I noticed. Yeah, it's basically commodity vouchers. So it's because, of course, based on the outcomes we have, that we have the outcome of liters per person per day. So it makes sense to use the commodity vouchers. But one thing is that there are prices. If you have like a long-term project, that goes throughout like the winter, summer, so there is a difference in the price, and also a difference in the price depending the distance that the tracker has to travel. But also, for example, if it is household vouchers, some households might choose to take less water, or might need to ask for more water than they're entitled in their voucher. So how do you deal with all this?
Yeah, I think. Parvin, can you specifically look at the question about seasonal variations in prices and how the MRO helps you with that?
I think, like I mentioned earlier, with regards to the seasonal calendar, as part of the seasonal calendar, you're looking at where do people get water at different times. If they're spending money at any point while they're getting the water, how much does it cost them to get that water? So that being the case, that is part of the consideration that goes into the process of determining the price around with the water tracking. And as it were, for instance, in Ethiopia, more often than not, there's usually a discussion both with the water vendors and with the DPP in terms of determining what would be the suitable, whatever, at least a price around the water. So usually there's quite the discussion around the water. I mean, the price for the water that would be utilized.
Yeah, great. Jacinta, are you there now?
Yeah.
Great. Do you want to try to ask you're asking a question, and this is the same question you asked at our last webinar. It's about exit strategies. Do you want to say a little bit more about how what you're thinking about exit strategies in water trucking is?
Okay, earlier she had mentioned about the community. Okay, there are some communities that have recurring drought. You see, the practice of water tracking has to be there year in, year out. So in such a case, where you have to use vouchers and it becomes a routine approach, do you really have an exit strategy in such a location or in such areas? And if maybe the market assessment could incorporate some exit strategies in such situations? I was just trying to think.
That's a great question. Pardon, or Roger, how do you see market assessment tools could be used to help define both in some ways an exit strategy is the limits of our intervention. It's about how often, how long do we intervene that goes beyond just the usual until the money runs out.
Yeah, wow. I think that was something, sorry, go ahead, Roger.
I was going to say this. It's a tough one, and I think, if I'm right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think exit strategy is always a tough one when we're talking about water tracking. So I would encourage the group not to think about exit strategy as a cash problem, but as a water tracking problem. It doesn't really matter how you organize the water tracking. You still have the same exit strategy problem, right?
Yeah. I think, and that's something we did discuss a bit. It was going to be part of my last sort of slide, that the exit strategy, it's good to be clear in terms of what we want to define as the exit strategy around the water tracking. And I mentioned this because I remember Rick mentioned that NRC was considering the possibility of getting into water tracking for Ethiopia, yeah. And a couple of things. One being that if you need to agree on what would be, so to speak, your indicators in terms of saying this is what would define for us the point at which we think we would exit from the water tracking. But then two, and this I'm sure is common to all WASH practitioners, looking at the more permanent options. If you're looking at if it does rain, if there are beer cards in the area, are they actually able to, do they need rehabilitation, or some of those things that help with the other options that would be available if post the water tracking stage. Because let's acknowledge, even when you look at the seasonal calendar, water tracking in essence, if done by the community by themselves, does not take place 12 months in a year. Yeah, it's usually during a certain period when there's clearly a higher level of need. So that being the case, how can we support the other options so that it helps facilitate and of course the resilience, the longer term issues.
Great, good. And with that comment on exit strategy, we're going to exit from this webinar. It's we've gone for an hour and a half. I want to really thank Parvin and Andy and all of the panelists and the participants. I found this really interesting, and I look forward to the third in our series of water trucking webinars, which will take place in mid-January. And I will contact you all via Facebook and email in the future to ask for presentations and to put a focus on the topics to be discussed. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great week. Bye now.
Thanks.
Jarek, thanks very much for organizing it.
Thank you. Bye.